This is Karen with NewClevelandRadio.net, and it is time for The Rant with Barbara Rose Brooker and her special guest, Dr. Erica Holmes. Barbara Rose Brooker is not only an author, an activist for human rights, and also an activist for ageism. She's a teacher, a speaker, and a weekly podcaster on NewClevelandRadio.net. Dr. Erica Holmes is a well known clinical psychologist, author, media consultant, trauma expert, and she is many more things. Just ask one of her best friends, Suzy Unger. Suzy Unger is also with us, and she's a well known ex talent agent. I'm not sure you're so much ex anymore, a therapist and activist for human justice and living the rights for the LGBTQA groups. So today we want to welcome both Barbara and Erica and Suzy to The Rant. So Barbara, tell us, what are we going to talk about today?
Oh my God, don't get me started ranting. I want to, because I'll just go on and on and on about the trauma we're all living in and about white people and their racism and their white privilege. Don't get me started because I want to hear from the fabulous guest, Dr. Erica Holmes, and I want to hear from the fabulous Suzy Unger, and you too, Karen. And I will start with Dr. Erica Holmes with one question. First of all, thank you for being here. It's an honor to talk with you. The question I have, and there's so many. Oh, before I start, this is in honor of the Floyd family and in honor of Ray Shard, my rant today, and all the people before him who have been lynched. So my question today, Erica, is you're a trauma expert, you work in that. And now that we are watching, the white community is watching on TV while they're eating their popcorn, cold-blooded lynchings of Black men, Black children, but more specifically lately, Floyd and Ray Shard.
And women.
And women, excuse me, of course. I'm going to mention the women later, but I want to know that trauma that is inherited by the African American community and the white people who can't identify with the trauma. How is this trauma going to heal now? Is it possible? And what is trauma?
Well, first, thank you, Barbara, for having me on. I'm really excited to be here today. I've watched a couple of your other podcasts and they're amazing. Thank you for having me on. And I'm glad to be here with Suzy and Karen. Wow, big questions. To simply define trauma is really an kind of unexpected experience that overwhelms a person's usual way of coping, just simply put. So it is an experience that overwhelms a person's usual way of coping that usually involves some threat to bodily integrity or physical integrity, so sexual assault, physical assault, or also psychological integrity. And generally, that threat is so severe that it ignites the person's fight, flight, or freeze response, which is a neurobiological response. And so the person could attempt to flee, which when we look at some police shootings, we see that. The person could attempt to fight when they are threatened, or the person could freeze or have what we call like a possum response. And these neurobiological responses are actually involuntary responses. The person has no control over it. And generally, we don't know whether we are a fighter, a fleer, or a freezer until we're actually in that situation, because it is our nervous system that takes over, our frontal lobe, which is responsible for planning and thinking and impulse control, is actually shut down. When I'm teaching, I say the midbrain, which is where the fight, flight, or freeze lives, actually hijacks the frontal lobe. So you're not thinking, you're not doing these behaviors consciously or voluntarily. So we don't know whether we're fighters, freezers, or fleers until it actually happens. So that trauma, actually, it is a neurobiological response, and it lives physiologically in the body even after the trauma has left. So that's my 2-minute overview of what trauma is.
Do you think, Suzy, that Ray Shard's running away, he was scared because he didn't want to be shot like George Floyd was and tortured? So you're saying this trauma I would see as a defense, instead of the police saying, well, he ran away, that really is not good. Not only the police, but I'm disappointed in the media reporters too, saying that over and over again. He shouldn't have run, he shouldn't have grabbed the taser. But what you said about trauma, that's very interesting to me, that you don't always know whether you're going to be a runner, you're going to freeze, because the trauma is so old, it's so inherited. Now it's worse than ever. Is it not? It's worse than ever. How do you think the African American community, and I'm not even saying the white community, because how can they know the trauma? Mm-hmm. So I'm saying, how do you think that the African American community will heal for this, or does it depend on the reform that is going to perhaps happen?
So I want to answer this question, and I'll also give time for Suzy to respond as well. But what I will say is, it's so interesting the way that the world is responding to the events now. I think that, or I know that, for the first time since the enslavement and the Middle Passage to the United States, for the first time, there is beginning to be conversations about the impact of 400 years of slavery, enslavement, and oppression on the African American community, and an acknowledgement by some, a beginning acknowledgement by some, that there is a legacy or history of this trauma. And I think that we're just at the beginning. We're only an inch in, because up until this point, this country has truly never acknowledged that Africans who were brought to this continent and then subjected to almost 400 years of enslavement, and then an additional until 1965 legal segregation and oppression, that there was any trauma. Before, it was like, okay, it ended on this day and now it's over. So there's no healing, because you have to remember that African Americans in this country are educated in the same system that you are. So what we've been taught, what I've been taught over my 50 years of living, is that it happened so long ago, get over it. And any unhealthy behaviors that you see occurring within the community is inherent. That there is no acknowledgement that there was something that happened to multiple generations of a people there, for which there was not even acknowledgement, much less treatment or processes to heal. And so anything that happens within your community or to you is inherently a deficit within you. And so even within our community, we have to now heal and learn a different way of understanding ourselves through an intergenerational trauma lens. And so at the same time, as you mentioned, now white folks are waking up. There also has to be a re-education education within the African American community. And from my perspective, healing begins with acknowledging that we have suffered a history of trauma in this country. Suzy, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, first of all, I love what you just said. And Erica, Dr. Holmes was my trauma professor. So we have a personal relationship, and I learned from this boss, because she's a boss. And I didn't understand what trauma was in the same way I didn't understand what privilege was, in the same way I didn't understand what a microaggression was or systemic racism. And so now all of a sudden people are talking about and throwing around these words, and everyone, not everyone, people, I think, are trying to understand what this even means. And it's getting complicated because there's still a racial divide. There will always be a racial divide. I can never understand your experience, ever. And the first thing I see when you come through the door is the color of your skin. And if we ignore that and don't name that, and that racism is internalized, and internalized racism and systemic racism has set up the paradigms that allow this kind of behavior. And you know what came up for me, Erica, as you were speaking, is I remember as a little girl, and I was brought, by the way, Barbara is my mother for all of you out there, but I was brought up in a, obviously very liberal, open, fantastic. And yet, as a little girl, I remember looking at National Geographic and seeing pictures of little Black children and going, oh, isn't that sad? And we would like separate it and go, oh, that's so sad. And they'd be like starving and bone. And so we start to internalize those images, right? And so you as a woman, as a teacher, as a mother of a Black son, how has that personally affected you and everything that is going on?
And a wife.
Right, and a wife, and a sister of two brothers.
And a sister, yes, and yes,
Yes, it's so interesting. I don't think I've ever admitted this publicly, but when my son was born, I was so excited. I always wanted to be a mother, and so I was so anticipating him. And I wanted to be a mother of sons. Maybe that's because I'm a sister to brothers, and so I always wanted to have a boy. So I was so excited, but it wasn't until maybe he was a week old and I got over the trauma of childbirth that I looked at him, and I actually made the decision not to have any more children. When he was about a week old, I was so saddened because I began to realize the life that he had ahead of him. Regardless of our social status, me and his father, regardless of our education, that no matter how we attempted to protect him, I knew the life that he would have as a Black man in this country. And I decided not to have any more children. I was like, I could not, I don't think emotionally or psychologically tolerate that. And that was the decision that I made and why I only had one biological child.
Can you say more about that? The reason why the sadness?
Because I knew that I see him today, he's 20, and I see him as my baby, right? I knew that as soon as I'm 5'3", and I knew that as soon as he surpassed me in height, regardless of his age, he would be seen as a danger. And from that point on, he would have a target on his back. And it wouldn't matter how much education he has or how much I travel, travel and take him around the world, or what he's exposed to, that what they would see when he surpassed me in height is a big Black man. And that in the United States, this skin has been weaponized. It has been connected through stereotypes and reinforced through the media with two primary stereotypes, and that's aggression and laziness.
Yes.
It is that aggressiveness that will get him killed, and it is the stereotype of laziness that will prevent him from, or I won't say prevent, but create huge barriers for him to achieve those things that I know have been implanted in him to succeed. And so if you cannot fulfill your destiny or your purpose or your talent, it kills your soul. And if you're seen as aggressive, even benign or neutral interactions become deadly. And that's what we're seeing today. And that is what we're seeing today. And so I had to do a lot of work and continue in my parenting to instill in him those things that I can instill in him around self-esteem and loving himself, I call him my chocolate sugar baby, and loving himself and the beauty and the richness in the skin and understanding the rich heritage that, our heritage did not begin on a slave ship. That we, in Africa, we had thriving communities. So instilling all of that and also, releasing that grip of protection as he's gotten older, imagine, the lioness, but I can't smother him to the degree that he's afraid of the world or that he's afraid to launch, right? Or to step out. And so I had to kind of do some mindfulness and deep breathing and lean on my faith. I'm a woman of faith to say, so many people, he wanted to stay home for college. And I had to muster every ounce of courage and faith that I had in me to say, no, you need to go away, because I kept him in this protective bubble. And I'm like, you're turning into a man and you need to go away so that you can spread your wings and see that you can stand on your own 2 feet. And I will cover you in the prayer of my faith and believe that you can be protected. And of course, continually having the talk. This is what you do if you're, stopped by the police. And he didn't drive until last year. And I was so thankful that he wasn't rushing to do that. But even, going to school up in San Francisco, if you're out with your friends and the police stop you and and his friends are very diverse. As a matter of fact, in many of his friends, he's the only African in his friend group. He's the only African-American male. But, this is what you don't have the same privilege as others. So you keep your mouth shut. If you can get away and get on the BART or something to go back to the dorm, you do that. You don't have, and sadly, in his first semester in school 3 years ago, he had that experience and he was trying to tell his friends, hey, chill out. No, we need to go back to the dorm. We can't be in this park. And they were questioning like, why? We have a right. And he was like, Mom, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. So, so it was that fear. And of course, when he tells me and we're on the phone, I'm being calm and I'm being the rock and I'm being mom. But of course, my heart is like clenched because I'm like, that could have been my son's day. That could have been the evening that I would have gotten a call,
Erica, as I hear your story as a mother, Caucasian mother of 2 young adult Caucasian boys, I worry about them, but obviously not in the same way. And when I brought that up last week in our podcast, it was interesting because the comment back was, you most likely will not hear a Black mother say that, she looks forward to, that she sees her sons, living in this world for quite a long time.
Oh, yeah.
And, Black mothers don't know if their child is going to make it another day. And it made me realize, I didn't understand white privilege, but I certainly do now, because my son is walking down the street with your son. Obviously, your son is going to be noticed as being different.
Exactly.
And it should not be happening.
Exactly. And that's really like the hallmark of the definition of white privilege. I know so many individuals kind of shrink away from that term because they believe that it means white racism. That if I say that I have white privilege, then I'm saying that I'm a racist. And actually, and it also does not mean that if I say that there's white privilege, I don't struggle. The only thing that white privilege means as a core concept is, yes, you struggle. And as a woman, there's oppression. You experience oppression, but your struggles and oppression are not because of the color of your skin.
Right.
And that's it at its core.
Erica, can you talk about, because as you're describing the fear of your son just walking down the street, something that I know Barbara never had to deal with, I've never had to deal with. Can you talk about the role of PTSD, another word that is thrown around, and I don't think people really understand when people say PTSD, what does that mean and how does that land in racism?
So PTSD is a diagnostic term in the same way that someone is diagnosed, for example, with a medical illness, diabetes or cancer. So PTSD is a cluster of symptoms that are diagnosable and we would treat clinically. And PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress syndrome, and is the result is a potential result of experiencing a traumatic event, as I described earlier. And the four major clusters of symptoms are hypervigilance, so being hyper aware of your surroundings and things that might happen, including a hyper startle response. Avoidance, so avoidance of people, places, and things, even emotions that might remind you of said event. A development of negative cognition and mood, which are those negative thoughts and behaviors that you internalize, like, oh, the world isn't safe, people aren't safe, things aren't safe, I'm incompetent because I can't protect myself, there's something wrong with me because this event happened. And you can have, PTSD, there's so many experiences that fall within the realm of what is considered traumatic because it's subjective to the person, that there are many events that could cause a PTSD response. And even if a person doesn't have all four symptoms, the person can have one or two of those symptoms and may not actually meet the diagnosis for PTSD, but they have what we call a trauma spectrum disorder. So they still have psychological or emotional responses or symptoms that impair functioning as a result of experiencing that trauma. And so when we think about, this intergenerational transmission of trauma, there's been a lot of research within the Native American community recent research around the experience and documenting intergenerational trauma. So what happens, there have been also studies done on Holocaust survivors and their subsequent generations, and also some from the the Japanese internment camps as well. And so the literature is beginning to document what happens after these experiences or this exposure to traumatic events. Well, when you look at the history, the length of traumatic exposure that African Americans have from the time the first boat left the west coast, the Ivory Coast of Africa, to what we're seeing today, you have multiple generations that are experiencing what we know are biological changes, that trauma actually changes the way that DNA is read and coded. They call that epigenetics. So the word that is used now scientifically is epigenetics. So they're able to identify that when a parent experiences trauma, that changes. Remember when I talked about that neurobiological response? It changes the neurobiology that parent has in response to the traumatic experience. And that change in neurobiology and DNA is passed on to the child. And so there's a physiological or biological component that's passed on, and there's a social component that is passed on. So as a parent who's experienced trauma, so if we go back to the first people who landed on this shore being enslaved, the way that they would parent their children is different when you're enslaved and their lives depend on the way that you parent and what you teach them. So the way that you parent them is going to be different than it would if you were freed and living in a country free of oppression, which means that now there's socialized behaviors that you see manifested that are an adaptation to trying to survive that have been characterized as inherently linked to culture. And they're not cultural, they're adaptations to oppression. There's a book that I'll mention that talks about this extensively by Joy DeGruy, Joy Leary DeGruy, called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. So she changes the PTSD from post-traumatic stress syndrome to post-traumatic slave syndrome. And she talks about some of these social adaptations. When I went to West Africa for the first time about 20 years ago, and I was meeting with some of the locals, to keep it brief, there was an African proverb that one of the men spoke to me, and he says, yeah, you know, the blood remembers.
Oh, wow.
The Barbara, I think you're muted.
Oh, no.
Oh, I had to-
Oh, there you are. There you are.
Okay, when you said the blood remembers, oh my God, Erica, everything you're saying is amazing, and it's going to take me time to process.
Yes.
But what I am enraged about and stunned about, to tell you the truth, is white people's reactions to what is going on with the police brutality and the shooting. You know, they always went away from Sandra Bland.
Yes.
Sandra Bland, George Zimmerman's walking around giving interviews, you know, and this and that. What really amazes me, and I said this last time, is so many of my colleagues, my white colleagues and friends, they're no longer my friends. They're off because they say things like, I arranged a little protest, I told you, white people take a knee. That's all I said, in honor of the Black Lives Matter movement and the Floyd family. This was a couple weeks ago. I got reactions like, Black people take a knee, white people don't. We're not submissive. I was called a white bitch. I was called racist. I was called, write your congressman and stop complaining. I mean, I have lists of them I have kept. They're not my friends anymore. But I wonder, is it so inherent, the slavery, the blood remembers, is it so inherent that it has passed on to, I'll just metaphorically call white people plantation owners? Are we still plantation owners? We don't have the plantations, so to speak. And there's been some policies, and thank God there's been Dr. King and Rosa Parks and others, but these are rights that should be inherent for all human beings anyway. So is the blood still remembering? What is going on with white people? And I'm not talking about the movie stars who are out there, you know,
Right.
doing their best and speaking out. I'm talking the general public. And I'm getting a lot of flack for talking against white people. And I'm speaking generally, of course.
Right.
But, and myself included, there's so much I didn't realize. One more thing, talking about your son. Two of my doctors are African American, and one of them has a son at Harvard Med School, and he said he has told him not to go for walks at night. He said, I warned him, and sure enough, he was walking along to meet a friend, admired a car, was looking at a car, and was picked up, arrested, thrown in jail overnight for no reason, except that he's African American. So is this ever going to stop, Erica? How can, or Dr. Holmes, I want to say, will this ever stop? How can it heal? frankly, Richard's going, the police who shot him is going, I think, going to get off, probably get off. I say then burn all the cities if he gets off. Dismantle the police completely. I know I'm going to get hate mail, but I just have to say what I feel. So the question is, when will blood stop remembering?
I think we have to give it a new memory, right? And so there has to be a history of acknowledging what has happened, acknowledging the, systematic and institutionalized racism, acknowledge, anti-Black racism, which is what we're talking about, because not all racism or prejudice are created equally. So acknowledge that. And the more that we have individuals who are waking up, which is why, even though this is such a sad time, there's a part of me that is exhilarated. There's a part of me that is hopeful, because for the first time, this is very different than the 92 uprising here after the King verdict. I wasn't here when there was the Watts riot, but what's different is that there's people, all of the marches that I've seen have been so diverse. And this racism is not a Black problem, it is a white problem.
That's right.
See white people taking the charge and, what we call, being woke, waking up and saying, I see it for the first time and I'm ready to do something about it. If we can keep that momentum going, then that voice becomes louder than what you teach, your friends or your family or your coworkers or your children or your children's children or your nieces and nephews. That then becomes our new memory. It's giving our blood something different to remember and to pass on. And so it can't stop. And I know there's still a lot of people who are like, they shouldn't have been doing this or they shouldn't have been doing that. And it's like, maybe, maybe not. But if a white man is not being killed for doing the same thing, for being drunk or sleep in his car or for cashing a check, if white people are not being killed for the same thing, then there's a problem. It's called a disparity. And it must be addressed. And I don't know about you, but I've never known that the death penalty was the penalty for a $20 bad check. No, that's not right.
A bad check. But you said something that just hit the whole thing, what I believe. Thank you for saying it. Racism is a white person's problem, listeners. It is not an African-American problem. So get over that. He shouldn't have run. They shouldn't have done this. And I want to address Suzy too, because I just want to say about Suzy, she knows a lot more and feels a lot more about it than I've learned everything from her. And she claims she's learned everything from you and really loves studying with you, admires you, and has internalized much of what you've taught her. And Suzy, I want to ask you, where are you?
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Okay. I know that sometimes I don't have the language that you and Dr. Holmes have that is so interesting about trauma and PTS and all the things. I just know as a white woman, 83-year-old white woman, as Dr. Holmes said, this is the beginning. It's like a little tiny inch where people are coming together outraged. I have not only felt outraged and enraged, but ashamed of not only America and of white people's responses, but how do you, as a how old are you, my daughter?
Me? I'm 57.
Oh my God. All right, that's my 57-year-old daughter who's out there, not only as a therapist and helping so many people and at the LGBTQ community as well. I want to know, how do you feel about this? Do you think that white people can get together and say and stop blaming?
I think that we have been, these conversations have been concealed. No one's been talking about it. And I know that when I was in grad school, I had 2 professors of color, period, the end. I had you and I had JD. And those and Theo, those resonated because we talked about what was real. With all my other professors, I'm sorry, I'm going to say it. It was, we never talked. We never had these conversations. And there are seas of people. As an African-American professor, for you, I can't imagine what it is like to teach white students who don't want to get it, who don't want to have these conversations, who want to be therapists, but don't understand the emotional and the mental impact of trauma. I don't know how you have been able to do that and been brave enough to be the one who is able to have these conversations. And it's funny because there really are a tiny handful, and we never talked about it in school. I mean, we did in your class, we did in JD's class, we did in Theo's class, but primarily we didn't. What do you think about that as a professor, as an educator, as a Black woman? Because that's where it starts, is with education. It has to start with education. And in order to be educated, you have to get really messy, and you have to own what privilege looks like, what it feels like. And for us to be able to say, I'm racist. I didn't even know it, and I'm a racist. And let's go from there.
I agree that it starts with education, but again, when you have, that's, the hallmark of systemic racism, right?
Yes.
Education, right? The educational system ignores a whole body of history and also a whole body of knowledge around the impact that history has had on the residents of the country. And so we don't learn it, and it doesn't start it shouldn't start in graduate school.
That's correct.
So sometimes when I'm teaching, especially courses that are specifically designed to talk about diversity or race or inclusion, those nice words, I'll ask students, I might have a class of 20, and I'll ask, and of course, of those 20, there might be 1 or 2 African Americans, maybe 1 or 2 Latinx, but, majority, it's a predominantly white institution, so the majority of students identify as white, but I'll ask them, let me see by a show of hands, how many of you had an African American teacher in elementary school? And sometimes even with the students of color, we'll say no one will raise their hand. By junior high, there might be 1 or 2. By high school, there might be 1 or 2 in a class of 20. And by, in their undergrad, you might have 4 people who said they had an African-American instructor. So even for some students in a master's program coming into I might be the first African-American instructor that they've ever had, which is important because what that means is that for the majority of students that I teach, they have never had an African-American in power over them, in an evaluative power over them.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, it is so important, and I'm going to have to, I can't, this is a whole part 2. The system the fact that who is education for? How do you even, you're right, grad school. And what are the systemic racism that allows these structures that it's primarily white people who have money and who have the ability to go get educated? Erica, this conversation, we need part 2, 3, 4, and 5. I have a client, and so I have to go.
Oh, darn. Oh, thank you, Suzy, for being on. We have to do another one, right, Cameron?
Absolutely.
I mean, I have never heard this subject of education. I mean, unless you're a movie star, you never really hear from African-American people.
Mhm.
Except on the 15-minute interview, on TV where
Right.
everyone's glammed. We're
Right.
not talking about that. This
Right.
is systemic. This is systemic. And I'm sorry to be so inarticulate and raging about how enraged I am against white people, because I'm one too. So I don't want to sound like I'm up here and the white people are down there. I'm speaking about all of us.
Yes.
People. Yes.
Well, this is our opportunity to become educated, which education doesn't stop when you leave school. And
Yes.
it's really important to remember. And I think if we keep talking about it and talking about it in a manner where people can hear it,
Yes.
I think we're going to see change. We're already seeing little bits and pieces of it. But a Black man and a Black woman have to be able to walk down the street and feel as safe as anyone else.
And not be shot in the back, unarmed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Children roughed up for jaywalking.
So, Dr. Holmes, for people who want to find you, where do they go?
So you can find me on my website, which is docerica, DOCERICA.com. So very simple, DOCERICA.com. I'm also on Instagram at It's Doc Erica, ITSDOCERICA, Twitter and Facebook. It's Doc Erica. So you can find me on social media. Please follow me. I have.
And what about your book?
Your book right there. That book right there.
Book right there. Let me show you a copy of it.
Yes.
I've been thinking about
Writing with purpose.
relationships. You can find my book on Amazon and at any other major retailers. Dating with Purpose is actually a workbook that takes you through exercises to help you to gain insight about how you date and connect with others.
Fabulous.
I
And-
am reading it. Yes.
And Barbara, where can people find you?
Yes.
BarbaraRoseBrooker.com. My podcasts are there, TV appearances, and so forth and so on. My latest novel is available on Amazon.com, and as Erica says, all the other sites. It's on Target too, Target.com. It is about ageism and falling in love with a much younger bisexual, biracial man. It brings in some of the issues we're talking. Well, no, it doesn't. Nothing can bring in the issues we're talking about. They just happen. But that's where you can find me, BarbaraRoseBrooker.com, and also agemarch.org. Karen and I are having the first virtual Age March in history to celebrate age pride for all ages, all race, all genders.
And Dr. Holmes, you have to be a part of it.
Absolutely.
Oh, yes.
And Karen, thank you so much.
As
Our
always,
leader, our warrior, thank you.
I love you all. And let's have Dr. Holmes back on.
Please.
We've got to talk
Please.
about this.
Yes.
Second part
Yes.
of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.
All right.
Bye-bye.